All right, so get this. Are you ready for this? President Trump just kind of slammed on the brakes when it comes to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The FCPA.
Right.
We've got the CBS News article, and it's like, whoa, it breaks it all down. It's pretty intense stuff. So we're going deep today, figuring out what this all means, for us businesses and for the world.
Yeah. It's interesting because he's not trying to like get rid of the FCPA altogether. It's more like he's hitting pause on how it's actually enforced.
Mm.
What he did was he signed this thing called an executive order. It's basically like a direct command, right from the president. And it puts all these FCPA investigations and prosecutions like on hold for 180 days.
180 days, that's like, whoa, that's a pretty significant pause. So it's not like companies can just go wild and start like bribing everyone, right?
Yeah, no, it's not a free-for-all. But this executive order like also tells the Justice Department that they got to come up with new rules for enforcing the FCPA. And that's where things could get kind of interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so before we dive into all that, let's back up for a sec. What exactly is the FCPA and why should we care? Why is this a big deal?
So the FCPA basically says it's like illegal for, U.S. companies and individuals to bribe foreign officials just to get some kind of business advantage.
Right.
It's been around for a while, since the 70s. And it was really created to try and make things fair for U.S. businesses abroad and, try and like curb global corruption.
So if I'm getting this right, the idea is that American companies, they shouldn't have to like resort to bribery just to compete with companies in other countries where maybe those practices are more common?
Exactly.
Okay.
But, this whole freeze thing, it stirred up a lot of debate because you've got some experts that are like, really worried. Like they're saying this could turn into a Wild West scenario where bribery just becomes even more, rampant.
Yeah, I can see why they'd be worried about that.
Yeah.
So let's get into Trump's reasoning here. Why does he think hitting pause on the FCPA is a good move?
Well, he's basically said that the FCPA puts American businesses at a disadvantage compared to these, foreign companies that don't have to follow these strict rules. And he's also said that it like prevents the U.S. from getting to, important resources overseas.
So he's essentially saying that the FCPA, it's kind of tying the hands of American companies, keeping them from making deals and like competing in a way that makes sense. But doesn't that create like an ethical problem?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you've got people who are like big supporters of the FCPA. They see it as like a super important tool for fighting corruption and making sure competition is fair. They think American companies should be held to like a higher standard.
Right. And that by playing by the rules, they're like setting a good example for the rest of the world. But I'm guessing there's like a flip side to this argument.
Yeah, you've got critics of the FCPA who say it's just way too much, too burdensome, and that it really puts U.S. companies at a big disadvantage. They say it creates all this unnecessary red tape, bureaucracy, and makes it super tough for American businesses to compete in places where bribery is unfortunately like just the way things are done.
Yeah, I can see that point too. It's got to be tough if you're trying to do business in a place where everyone else is playing by a different set of rules. So where does this leave us? How has the FCPA actually been enforced before, and what happens if you break it?
Well, there have been some pretty big cases. Like you've got Walmart, for example. They had to pay this massive settlement, like $282 million, because they were allegedly bribing officials in places like Mexico, India, Brazil, just to get their stores open faster.
Wow, $282 million. That's a lot of money just to like cut a few corners. So I guess that sends a pretty strong message that the U.S. government isn't messing around when it comes to enforcing the FCPA.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's not just Walmart. You've got Raytheon, the defense contractor. They had to cough up over $300 million to settle charges that they were bribing officials in Qatar. So, these are just a couple examples, but they show that the FCPA has some teeth.
Okay, so who's doing the enforcing here? Who's keeping an eye out for these violations and like bringing these cases to light?
Well, it's kind of like a two-pronged approach. You've got the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. They handle the civil side of FCPA violations. And then you've got the Department of Justice, the DOJ, and they can bring both civil and criminal charges.
So this is serious business then. What kind of penalties are we talking about here for companies or individuals that are found guilty?
Well, the DOJ can hit them pretty hard. Individuals could face up to 20 years in prison for bribery. And companies, they could get slapped with fines that are double the profits they made from the shady deal.
Ouch. That's a pretty big deterrent. Not just a slap on the wrist, it's like real consequences. But let's zoom out for a sec. How does the U.S. approach to fighting corruption compare to the rest of the world? Are we the only ones with these kinds of laws?
Not at all.
Yeah.
Actually, the U.S. has been like a major force in getting other countries, especially developed countries, to adopt similar laws against bribery.
Yeah.
Many of them now have their own versions of the FCPA, partly because of, pressure from the U.S.
So we've kind of been leading the charge in the global fight against corruption. But what happens if we start to back away from that role? Like, what if we weaken our own enforcement? Could that have ripple effects around the world?
That's the big question.
Yeah.
If the U.S. is like, hey, we're not going to take this FCPA thing so seriously anymore, well, other countries might start to think the same way.
Mm.
And that could lead to less effort to, fight corruption globally.
So it's not just about American companies then. It's about like setting a standard for the whole world.
Yeah, exactly. And there's another thing U.S. companies got to think about. If the FCPA is weaker, even if the U.S. government isn't really paying attention,
Right.
they could still get in trouble in other countries that have like stricter laws against bribery.
So they could be like caught in this legal mess even if they think they're doing everything right here in the US. That's
Yep.
a lot to think about.
Yeah.
It sounds like this whole FCPA freeze thing could really shake things up.
Yeah, it definitely makes things more complicated for sure.
Yeah.
It's like this balancing act between, helping American businesses and sticking to ethical standards globally.
When you put it that way, it really shows how everything's connected. Decisions we make here, they can have a big impact on other countries too. It's like we have this responsibility to be a good example because, we have a lot of influence on the global economy.
Right. And the U.S. has, historically been a leader when it comes to promoting transparency and ethical business practices.
Yeah.
So the question is, what kind of message does this freeze send to everyone else? And in the long run, does it actually help or hurt American companies?
That's a tough one. It seems like there are good arguments on both sides, right?
Yeah.
Some people are saying the FCPA is like super important to keep things fair and prevent corruption, and others are saying it holds American companies back.
It's a real dilemma, and there's no easy answer. But I think it's important to look past just the immediate economic impact and think about the long-term consequences of, making it easier to be corrupt.
Yeah.
What kind of world do we want to live in? One where everyone's just bribing each other, or one where businesses have to follow some ethical standards?
That's a really good question. And I think that gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. This isn't just about some boring legal stuff. It's about values and principles. It's about the kind of world we want to create for ourselves and for our kids.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this whole FCPA situation so interesting. It forces us to really think about, what's the role of business in society? And do we have a responsibility to be ethical even when it's hard?
So what do you think, listener? Where do you stand on this? Do you think Trump was right to freeze the FCPA, or is this like a step backwards when it comes to fighting corruption?
Whatever you think, it's clear that this decision could really change things in the world of business. It's definitely something to keep an eye on.
For sure. And I think it's also a good reminder that even though we might be focused on what's happening right now, issues like this have a lasting impact. It's not just about today or tomorrow. It's about the kind of world we're building for the future.
Yeah, it's about making smart choices, thinking about what might happen, and having real conversations about the kind of world we want to live in.
Well said. And I think that's a perfect place to wrap up our deep dive into this whole FCPA freeze. We've covered a lot today, from like the basics of the law to, these big global implications.
We've looked at the arguments for and against the FCPA and all the potential risks and rewards, and hopefully giving you something to think about.
And we always want you to keep digging deeper and exploring different perspectives and coming to your own conclusions. I mean, that's what the deep dive is all about. So until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
It's amazing how this one executive order just brings up so many questions. We've gone from the actual rules about bribery to this huge discussion about, global ethics and the future of business. It really shows how everything is connected. Yeah, what might seem like something happening only here can actually have a big impact all over the world.
And it makes you think about how tough it is to do business when different countries have different ideas about what's okay.
Right. What's totally normal in one country might be illegal in another. And that's why the FCPA has always been so tricky. It's basically trying to make U.S. companies follow certain rules, even when they're working in places where those rules aren't really followed.
So what happens now? What should people be watching for as this whole thing plays out?
Well, I think we got to see what the Justice Department does with those enforcement guidelines.
Yeah.
Are they going to really weaken the FCPA or try to find some middle ground,
Yeah.
Where they can support U.S. businesses but also still fight corruption?
Right, because those new guidelines are going to be important. And I bet other countries are watching this really closely, too, to see how the U.S. handles it.
Oh, for sure. If the U.S. loosens up on the FCPA, it might make other countries think they can do the same. Or it could give an advantage to countries with tougher laws against bribery.
It's kind of like a chess game where every country is trying to guess what the other one's going to do next. And the stakes are pretty high. We're talking about, the whole global market and the fight against corruption, which affects all of us.
It brings up a big question. Should ethics matter in international business? Can we just ignore them to make more money, or are they like a basic rule we have to follow even if it means losing out in the short term?
That's a tough question, and there's no easy answer. I think it's something each of us has to decide for ourselves as we, try to make sense of this crazy world.
What we choose today will affect what the world looks like tomorrow. So as you keep hearing about this whole thing, ask yourself, what kind of world do you want to live in? And what role should businesses have in making that world?
That's a powerful thought. It reminds us that we're all a part of this. We're not just watching it happen, we're actually shaping the future of global business.
So stay informed, stay involved, and keep thinking critically.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the FCPA freeze. We hope you learned something and maybe even had your mind blown a little. And remember, the conversation doesn't stop here. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.